And I would argue the primary driver of this obesity and metabolic disease epidemic is the food industry, hyperpalatable foods. I started noticing that 2, 3, 4 months after surgery, people returned to the clinic and they were reporting neurological changes. Their sense of smell, sense of taste. I often compare the brain to a computer. The similarities are actually quite shocking, but every computer requires the right input in order to function properly and to provide the right output. And the brain really is where the master controls for weight and appetite, metabolism, blood glucose, all of this. So I ask them, so tell me about your sleep, and they'll smile. I don't get to sleep till 2 in the morning. Why not? I'm playing games or something. So absolutely, it is. Sometimes I will tell people it's more important than exercise.
All right, welcome. We have with us today Dr. David Brown. He is a bariatric specialist surgeon out of Boise, Idaho. Dr. Brown, thanks for being here. Appreciate it. If you wouldn't mind, just for those that have not met you before, just quick summary of your background.
Yeah, I'm a farm boy. Grew up on an alfalfa farm in Oregon, but I'm a bariatric surgeon in Boise, Idaho, and had been here for about 18 years and done about 3,000 bariatric operations.
So you do 18 years. So I guess at this point, probably much of it is laparoscopic, gastric sleeves and whatnot is the in vogue thing these days. But you went Roux-en-Y and all the different variations.
Really, I trained in the bypass, and that was the gold standard for about 20 years. And really, for the last 15 years, that the sleeve gastrectomy has become the primary operation performed by bariatric surgeons. So the sleeve is probably 80% of what I do.
Okay. And I guess obviously you see a lot of obesity and a lot of obese people. And what do you find is is everybody do well with a gastric bypass? Is that the experience? Generally, the literature seems to report pretty good, at least short-term benefits.
Yeah, it is by far the most effective therapy for obesity, diabetes, and these other metabolic diseases. But your question is a great one, and that is, the answer to that is we do see differences in outcomes as far as longevity of success, how well people do. And I think that's really the focus that I have been engaged in, is figuring out who's the most effective and why are they most effective compared to the people who maybe regain weight.
Let's just get right to it. Why do we have obese people? What do you think?
Great question.
$1 million question. That's $1 billion question, probably.
Very much. We're all familiar with the curves, the increase in prevalence of obesity in America and in Western civilization. There's recently one of the government officials who's out of Harvard, I think, said it's a brain disease based on genes. Our genes haven't changed over the last 40 years. There's clearly something going on. And I would argue the primary driver of this obesity and metabolic disease epidemic is the food industry, hyperpalatable foods, engineered foods that are altering people's neurocircuitry, which really governs all of this.
Yeah, fair enough. And I certainly don't disagree with the food. It's got to be the food. You can't think, obviously genetics have not changed significantly over, certainly not in the time frame that we've seen this dramatic rise in obesity. Genetics, correct me if I'm wrong, but genetics can have a modifying effect on obesity. People deposit fat in similar patterns to their siblings and their parents and that type of stuff. And there may be a tendency, but it's not the major factor, correct?
Right. This is the way I explain it to people, is that a person's genes, their DNA dictates to some degree how susceptible they are to the engineering in the modern food. So it definitely is a factor. You can have two people who really eat the same thing, who their phenotype is very different. One person will gain more weight and become more metabolically ill. So clearly genes have a role, but really the primary driver is the food.
So one of the things that we often associate bariatric surgeons with are these sort of super morbid obese people, these people with BMI 50, 60, 70, sometimes 80. And we see more and more that people that are falling into maybe the class 2, class 3 obesity, maybe they're not that big, still undergoing the surgery. In your mind, are those people that are maybe not 400 or 500 pounds, and maybe they're 100 pounds, 75 pounds overweight, Do they need the surgery, or could we fix it without this, you think?
Great question. I think to answer this, we have to understand what the traditional criteria for bariatric surgery are. They were essentially created in 1991 at the NIH, National Institutes of Health. It essentially was non-specialists who got together with really no input from bariatric surgeons or that data and created a list of criteria that just made sense to them. And for 40 years or whatever, that's really been the traditional criteria. Recently, there's been a better look, a more deep look into the actual clinical data, and it suggests if you're weighing the benefits to the risks, which you do in every case, what makes sense is actually offering these operations for people with metabolic disease whose BMI is as low as 30, and if they're of Asian descent, down to 27.5. Again, an allusion there to the gene factor. But the data is pretty clear in showing that the outcomes are overwhelmingly good for people who aren't that classic stereotypical picture of someone who's really big.
Yeah, obviously, I did years of orthopedics, and it's a hell of a lot easier than to operate on someone who's not morbidly obese than it is someone who's fairly lean. When I had a hip fracture and they were skinny, I was like, oh, this is a walk in the park. And then you get obviously the big ones, and you got to bring out the special retractors and deeper instruments and all that stuff, as I'm sure you're well aware of. And so why does, in your mind, whether it's sleeve gastrectomy, why does it work? What's going on that makes them lose weight?
I think you have to back up a little bit. So 8 years ago or so, I started noticing, at least my eyes were opened a little bit, I started noticing that 2, 3, 4 months after surgery, people returned to the clinic and they were reporting neurological changes. Their sense of smell, sense of taste. A lot of people would say, Doc, I get into a certain part of the meal, a certain stage, and I start sneezing. Or my nose starts running, or I get the hiccups. Very consistent. They started reporting neurological changes after surgery. And so I dug in. It's interesting. Functional MRIs, these brain scans that really have changed a lot of how we see the brain in the last 20 years. If you do these specialized functional MRIs, PET scans, you note significant differences in the anatomy and function of the brains who struggle with obesity and these other metabolic problems compared to normal weight individuals who don't have those metabolic problems. In other words, the brains are different. And it's interesting that if you take a group of people who are going to have bariatric surgery, you scan the brains before and then say 6 months after surgery, dramatic changes in their brain structure, function, even the size of their brain. So that's a very powerful piece of evidence that, wait a minute, something is going on with the brain that's connected to this. I believe, and I think the data is all there, that these bariatric procedures work primarily through the brain and the nervous system. And modern foods, engineered foods, they really cause dysfunction in the gut-brain connection, really through the vagus nerve. And for people who aren't familiar with the vagus nerve, it really is the primary pathway of information flowing between the brain and the gut. And we have these studies, animals and humans, they eat hyper palatable foods, and I would define that as high fat, high sugar. You see almost immediate dysfunction in the signals, neurological signals going from the gut into the brain through that vagus nerve. I often compare the brain to a computer. The similarities are actually quite shocking, but every computer requires the right input in order to function properly and to provide the right output. And the brain really is where the master controls for weight and appetite, metabolism, blood glucose, all of this. Well, as that vagus nerve becomes more dysfunctional, the brain becomes more dysfunctional in its control of those things. So, surgery, it works primarily through its, to some degree, restoration or resetting of that vagus nerve. And you're essentially changing the input into the brain. And when we do that, the output changes as well. Studies show, you look at someone who has diabetes and has surgery, they have essentially a cure of their diabetes very rapidly, meaning they have a change in their fasting insulin, in their blood glucose, all kinds of traditional measures of diabetes within a week. So these are things that can't be explained by weight loss. They haven't lost that much weight in a week. And in rodent models, you look and you see an expansion of the beta cell mass and number in the pancreas within a week after the operation. So that's just one example of the rapid changes that happen after surgery. And it's the neurological system is the only thing that can explain this.
Yeah, I've seen studies out there showing that people that are exposed to this sort of ultra-processed, hyper-palatable food, their brain is actually altered in a way so that they seek out that in greater and greater amounts. And you would think that obviously you've removed a portion of the stomach and the gastrectomy, but that by itself may not be the signal. It may be that you're no longer receiving these. Maybe it's just the fact that you're not eating as much of the stuff afterwards that causes that. Is that what you think is going on?
So I think the sleeve and the bypass are different in their mechanism of restoring vagus nerve health. The vagus nerve, Latin for wanderer, from the base of the brain down into visceral organs. In the stomach, there are thousands of little branches in the wall of the stomach. And studies have shown, I think it's a Vietnamese study, they did biopsies on stomachs. And what they found is in people who are obese or who have diabetes, they had less than half the nerve fiber density in the wall of their stomach. So there's a degeneration of the actual neurological structures and function in the wall of the stomach. There's a group out of Purdue, brilliant studies. They are arguing that due to the sophisticated networking of those nerve fibers in the wall of the stomach, there's some degree of local control, local management of stomach and intestinal function, but it's always communicating with the brain. In fact, they argue for what they term smart nodes or smart terminals within the stomach and nerve systems. If you have degeneration of those symptoms, this is my theory, speculation, but I've talked to the Purdue group and they think there's merit to it, that in someone who's obese, has diabetes, you have degeneration in that neural network in the wall of the stomach. And when you do a sleeve, you're removing 75-80% of the stomach. And in essence, you're removing the source of bad data into the vagus nerve system. So there are two time frames of neurological change. When I go and see somebody the day after their operation in the hospital, they'll say, "Doc, this sugar-free Jell-O in the hospital is so sweet. Oh, these artificially sweetened drinks, everything is so sweet in my sense of smell." So there are neurological changes happening overnight. And I think that it's the exclusion of these dysfunctional, degenerated networks in the stomach that can explain that overnight change. There are longer term changes that take weeks and months that occur higher up in the nervous system. So if you do a sleeve, you do a gastric bypass in rodents, in mice, which you actually can do, you see some differences. A week after a sleeve gastrectomy in a mouse, you sacrifice them, you look at their brains. What is an explosion of new neurites, nerve growth at the base of the brain in a place called the medulla oblongata. So there's an explosion of new neurological connections and growth. In the case of the bypass, what in those rodent studies is actual apoptosis. So you have cell death, neuron death, same location, base of the brain, basically. Ultimately, I think both of those pathways are driving the same fundamental change, and that is a neurological adaptation and growth, really, up into the brain, several centers of the brain. And in addition to those anatomical, functional changes that you see after surgery, there's a huge literature that shows that most measures of cognitive and executive function increase after surgery, which is astonishing, but it makes sense if you go back to that computer idea. You change the input, you change the output.
Let me ask you just a little bit of an related topic. Is the concept of fatty liver? It's not a concept; it actually occurs, and obviously, particularly when you're doing a laparoscopic procedure, one of the common things bariatric surgeons do is they shrink the liver by altering the diet successfully, at least in the short term. And so, what do you do to shrink someone's liver, and so can you figure out what causes fatty liver if you know how to fix it? Sort of.
Yeah, a lot of people thinking about this. In modern medicine, we have the tendency to simplify the problems and complicate the solutions with medications. In reality, I think the problems are far more complicated than we see. The solutions, fortunately, are usually a lot more simple. There's a lot of things that drive fatty liver. And your question makes me think of a sort of an overriding principle that involves the nervous system. People talk about carbs, sugar, the effect of adipocytes on the liver. There's a fascinating study from a group of radiologists. And they have the technology of doing 3D imaging of different organs, including the liver. And I think it was published a year, maybe 2 years ago. They looked at changes in the structure of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic nerves, specifically in the liver, throughout the process of developing fatty liver all the way to NASH, or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. And what they demonstrated was, as a person starts to get fatty liver, there's an expansion of those sympathetic fibers, their number. They increase in the number of those nerves. And as that diseased liver becomes more diseased, you get a collapse of those sympathetic fibers. I would argue that it is the nervous system that is primary driver of all of this, whether it's fatty liver, whether it's diabetes, whether it's chronic kidney disease, even inflamed visceral fat. It's driven primarily by dysfunction or disruption of the circuits between the gut, those specific tissues and cells, and the brain. And I mentioned the vagus afferent fibers becoming dysfunctional. They're not as robust. And with it, you get a shift in the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic, parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. As this happens, you get higher sympathetic nervous system activity and lower parasympathetic nervous system activity. And you can measure this with HRV, heart rate variability. So I really think this is probably the fundamental driver, is a shift in the autonomic nervous system and in the neurological inputs into the brain. And the output becomes a hyperactive sympathetic nervous system, a sort of pedal to the metal sympathetic activation. And those who maybe aren't as familiar, it's fight or flight. You're hiking in the woods, you see a bear, you're with your kids, there's 100 different changes that happen in your body very quickly to help you deal with that. It's really the sympathetic nervous system that's driving those changes and is controlling that. But it's the chronic hyperactivity and imbalance in that autonomic nervous system that is causing these end organ diseases. So I use the analogy of a light bulb. You think of a light bulb with a filament. If you put too much current through that light bulb, the filament burns out and the light doesn't work anymore. Or if you leave it on too long, it's that basic idea. It applies surprisingly well to this idea that you have overstimulation, chronic overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, and you look at any one of those organs and you see the chronic diseases that we're all talking about, whether it's diabetes or fatty liver or chronic kidney disease. Absolutely fascinating that in each of those end organs or tissues, if you cut the vagus nerve fibers, or sympathetic nerve fibers, you get cessation of progression of that disease. And this applies to the liver. Go ahead.
No, I was going to interesting because I was thinking about this, and if we look at like diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and obesity, people would say it's not because we're being chased by bears, or maybe some people that exercise a lot in a very intense way. You would assume there would be some sympathetic stimulation as well. So how is that being caused? Truly the imbalance between the autonomic branches, sympathetic, parasympathetic, might be contributing to this. How might that be? Because I can't say bears chasing me is why I got fat. That doesn't make sense. So how does this happen?
The food. So to illustrate it, you think the hypothalamus. If there's one center in the brain, there's really actually about 8 different centers in the brain that are involved in all of this processing and control. But if I had to choose one area, it'd be the hypothalamus. And there's this specific site in the hypothalamus, the arcuate nucleus. And there's 2 different major cell populations there, populations of neurons or brain cells. One population is called the POMC neurons, pro-opiomelanocortin neurons. The other is a Gaudy-related peptide neurons. And they function in an antagonistic fashion. When POMC neurons are active, Gaudy-related peptides are relatively inactive, and vice versa. This is directly connected to the autonomic nervous system, and maybe the primary site of governing that balance. We're relaxed, or when we eat food, we eat a meal, very quickly that shift moves from feeling hungry and looking for food. And in that state, the Gaudy-related peptide neurons are active. The POMC neurons are inactive. When we see food, we smell it, we eat it, that balance switches and the POMC neurons become much more active and the Gaudy-related neurons become less active. So you can think of it as a switch in the hypothalamus. And with everything in the body, it's really designed to be cycling back and forth. Awake, sleep, exercise, relaxing, cycling between these 2 states, higher sympathetic activity versus higher parasympathetic activity. With these hyperpalatable foods, what you get is a shift. They increase the activity of a Gaudy-related peptide hormones, and essentially there becomes a sustained hyperactivity in those neurons and a lower activity in POMC. You can say it's central control in the brain and no longer cycling between those 2 states. And so that's why really you get this pedal to the metal stress response. You're not being chased by a bear, but because of dysfunction in the vagus nerve, and as a result of that, this shift in the hypothalamus and other places in the brain, of course, we like to simplify, but you have a shift based on changes in that connection between the gut and the brain. Those signals in that direction going up to the brain, you get dysfunction and degeneration of that system of neurons. And then even if sympathetic activity doesn't change, relatively speaking, it's still much more active than the parasympathetic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a ratio of this. And I guess the question I would have then is, as you mentioned, you can monitor this through things like heart rate variability. And I assume there's studies on diabetics, obese people that show dysregulated HRV. Is that fair to say?
I would say it's the most consistent thing that no one looks at, and almost nobody, that even before someone becomes diabetic, their HRV goes down again, and that's just a measure of vagal afferent signaling. HRV goes down before someone gets coronary artery disease, before they get fatty liver. Elegant studies show that it actually precedes. The classic idea is, hey, you get diabetes, your blood sugar goes up, and that hyperglycemia damages tissues, including nerves. No, it actually precedes. You see a change in nerve physiology and function before there's any change in blood glucose or even insulin resistance.
If we have that knowledge ahead of time, how do we either can we reverse it? Can we fix it? Can we prevent it? Thoughts on that?
So when I teach my patients, they have surgery, and that's the most profound sort of explosive reversal of that imbalance in the autonomic nervous system. And plenty of studies show that. It's not controversial, but there's lifestyle stuff, lifestyle things that help to prevent that dysfunction, as well as to some degree reverse. And that's just the more difficult thing, is once these problems are developed, being able to reverse them. So I mean, I'm essentially carnivore, have been low carb for about 12, 13 years. And the reasons I think becoming more strict carnivore actually supports balance in all of this. So what people eat, I'm convinced that fasting is a part of that. Again, cycling, we're built to cycle. And after surgery, and maybe I should just say that, but it's because of those sensory changes after surgery, I would say the biggest result is for about 6 months after the operation, a person's brain is very malleable. We say it's plastic. And it's in that 6 months after surgery, by repeating very specific things every day, we can essentially reprogram those control centers in the brain and the networks through which they communicate. And when people do that, then it becomes actually very easy. It's not this war of discipline and willpower. But fasting, we're built for it. It's very powerful. And resistance exercise, I know something about that. And you're a good model for that. Resistance exercise. I recognized many years ago that if I had to choose between cardio and resistance, which I don't, but I do, I think resistance exercise in the end helps most with slowing the aging process, but also with this imbalance in the autonomic nervous system. We also teach our patients meditation, box breathing, resonance breathing, different exercises that have been shown to be quite effective in calming the sympathetic nervous system and activating the parasympathetic.
You didn't mention this, but I would assume that sleep and sleep quality probably impact this as well. Is that fair to say?
100%. If someone's 9 months out from surgery and they're just not doing as well as you would think, and they seem to be compliant, following the program, that's where my brain goes first. I ask them, so tell me about your sleep, and they'll smile. I don't get to sleep till 2 a.m. Why not? I'm playing games or something. So absolutely, it is. Sometimes I will tell people it's more important than exercise. That's debatable, but yeah, incredibly important in my experience and according to the data as well.
Let me just share a couple anecdotes with you and get your thoughts on this. I've met several now, 2 or 3, 700, 800-pound people who have gone carnivore and successfully have lost 300, 400, 500 pounds within the space of a few years and kept it off and have said for the first time in their life they don't feel addicted anymore. They felt like they found the off switch finally, even though despite years and years of trying everything possible. What do you think is going on physiologically, neurologically in that people where they have that success?
So I like analogies. I'll share this one. I think it's helpful, maybe in answering your question. You think of a warehouse, a big warehouse, and your manager. And as manager, you're in charge of inventory. And there's one door to this big warehouse. You are at the door, and you have an electronic scanner, just like you'd see in the store or something like that. And all the inventory, all the product that comes in through that door, and you scan the barcode, and exactly where it's supposed to go in the warehouse. Same thing with product leaving. You scan it, and in that way, you're able to keep meticulous track of inventory. Imagine something happens to your electronic scanner. It doesn't work anymore. Stuff is coming in. You're busy. You're flustered. You think, okay, put it over there. I'll remember this. Stuff leaving. You think, okay, mental note. You get the idea. It doesn't take very long until you have no idea what's in your warehouse. The human brain is absolutely incredible at inventory, at knowing how much fuel we have stored, how much we've consumed in the last day, the last 7 days. When we eat something that is not found in the natural world, it causes dysfunction in that electronic scanner. It confuses to some degree the nervous system. And over time, it becomes worse and worse, and it doesn't matter what you eat. It's not registering with the nervous system. The nervous system is sending out this powerful signal that, look, you're starving. You need to consume and store more energy. To your question, I would say there's nothing healthier for the human nervous system than meat and eggs. I think we're built for it. I think the human nervous system recognizes meat and eggs more clearly and easily than any other food. And I think any other approach, whether it's counting calories or even low carb, which I believe in, I think a carnivore diet is most effective. I don't know if I answered your question, but
one of the things I uniquely see are people with nervous system issues, whether it's peripheral neuropathy, gastroparesis, mental health issues, multiple sclerosis, do seem to get better, particularly when we include a little bit more fat in that aspect. And as the nervous system is largely composed of fat, particularly like the myelin sheaths around all the nerves, and obviously the vagus nerve is no different. Let me ask you, so this is, let's go to another topic here, because I think you'll have some insight into this. GLP-1s, Ozempics, the new drugs, the latest craze. And obviously, when we look at our incretin hormones, those are influenced. There's a neuroendocrine sort of signal going on that's causing us to release the L cells in the ileum to release GLP-1 and the other cells, GIP, and some of these other deals there. So what's going on with that, and what are your thoughts on those drugs?
Yeah, I think it's very misunderstood. I prescribed these medications for a short time until I really dug in and a deep dive to understand what's going on. If you look, the gastrointestinal tract, mouth to anus, is about 30 feet long. And in that 30 feet, there's around 400 square feet of surface area. So it's just an enormous surface area. And it's covered with different types of cells. One of them is called an enteroendocrine cell, a neuropod cell. And on one side of these enteroendocrine cells, they abut the inside of the intestine. And so they are sensing everything going through the intestine, the food that we eat, the bacteria. On the other end of that cell, so we're talking a very tiny microscopic space. On the other end of that cell, it abuts one of the billions of nerve endings of the vagus nerve, the synapse, essentially. That enteroendocrine cells has around 30 different molecules it can use to communicate across that tiny little distance, that synapse, with that nerve ending of the vagus nerve. One of those molecules is GLP-1. And there's a very aggressive, robust system in the body to break down that GLP-1 on site, right there at that synapse. But the idea is that signal goes through the vagus nerve into the brain to several different centers and communicates. Well, when you look at someone who's obese or who has diabetes, they have elevated levels of GLP-1 in their blood when they're fasting. So it's a little bit like diabetes. Maybe we're not seeing this appropriately. These injections, Ozempic, tirzepatide, etc., they're essentially synthetic forms of this gene. What we're doing, I say we, not me anymore, but what these injections are doing, they're increasing the level of this molecule to very high levels in a person's body. And instead of communicating through the vagus nerve, they go through the blood and they cross the blood-brain barrier and have some of the same effects. People have satiety and they're not hungry and they're turned away from food. The problem with that, problem that I have, and if you look at the data and the research, you can see it in there. The problem with that is this principle in nature of use it or lose it. It's like muscle. If you don't use a muscle, it atrophies. It becomes weaker and eventually smaller. The nerves are the same way. So essentially with these injections, they're bypassing the vagus nerve. And I think we can get tricked by this because ultimately in some people, it's going to make the fundamental problem worse. When you withdraw the injection, now you have a more dysfunctional vagus nerve. So it's a little more complicated than what in the marketing. I would argue they're not hormones, they're neurotransmitters. And there are more researchers who are arguing that these are neurotransmitters. They're not hormones like we think of traditional hormones.
So you would assume that just like any exogenous substance we enter the body, that the endogenous production gets shut down. So we lose the efficiency, perhaps we can't produce GLP-1 to the extent that we normally should be able to. Do you know I'm just wondering if this has some impact on, like you mentioned, the autonomic nervous system, if there's any studies looking at GLP-1 and HRV, perhaps. Has that been looked at?
Absolutely. I love where you're going. So one of the fundamental problems I have with these drugs is they were tested and developed for patients with diabetes and heart disease. Now, in those patients, you pretty much know their vagus nerve is already wrecked, okay? And they're helpful, they're beneficial, it's great. The problem is taking those medications and applying it just for weight loss. people who don't have diabetes, all these metabolic problems, and you're giving it to them for just weight loss. Those are the people in whom the vagus nerve is going to be damaged the most. So it's a paradox. The people who seem to be most successful with these injections as far as weight loss, they're being successful at the cost of the greatest dysfunction or damage to the vagus nerve. Sorry, what was your question again? I think I went off.
I was wondering if they had studies on HRV and GLP-1's outcomes.
Yes. Universally, what studies show is that these injections increase heart rate. Okay, and that should get your attention, because that initially, just at the surface, suggests some shift in the autonomic nervous system. In people whose vagus nerve is very dysfunctional, meaning diabetics, heart disease, you don't see much change in HRV. If you look at people who are metabolically healthy, yes, you see a very clear decrease in their HRV. You get a bump in heart rate. And if people understand HRV, that tells you there is an effect, a negative effect on the autonomic nervous system with these injections. There's been a lot of talk about muscle loss, okay, with these injections. I think it's a real thing. I've seen it in some pretty profound cases. People don't know that at the neuromuscular junction, where the motor nerves connect with the muscles and control those skeletal muscles, there's also input from the autonomic nervous system. It's incredibly important. There's a trophic influence, specifically of sympathetic nerve fibers into that neuromuscular junction. As people age, you can see that their MSNA, muscle sympathetic nerve activity, it increases. You see this with these injections. There are a few studies in healthy people that give injections, and then they test both HRV and muscle sympathetic nerve activity. And you see exactly what you would expect in someone who becomes more severe diabetic or heart disease. In other words, you're seeing a shift in the autonomic nervous system. So I'm of the belief that this issue of muscle loss with these injections, it's primarily because of that, the influence of those compounds on the autonomic nervous system.
Muscle loss is a concern with people who lose weight, regardless of the method they do that. And there are things we can do to mitigate it, resistance training, maybe up the protein, yes, things like that, which I think makes sense. I'm just curious, obviously as a bariatric surgeon, you would have seen patients who maybe have failed GLP-1s, or I think the medium-term data, and we're seeing this for weight loss, shows most people, when they stop them, regain the weight. It's not a permanent solution to anything else. But are you seeing people that are maybe left off in worse condition than they started going into it?
Yes, and that's a great question. So in theory, if you understand physiology, you take someone who's metabolically healthy, but they're overweight or obese and they want to lose weight. You give them these injections and they lose weight. But at some point, they stop for whatever reason. They stop the injections. Yes, it's my belief, and there is some data, anecdotal and otherwise, that suggests people who were not insulin resistant develop insulin resistance upon withdrawal. So you would expect development, and I would suggest fairly rapid development of these metabolic problems. I did a video on this, I don't know, a year ago. So anything that's influenced by the autonomic nervous system, if this is true, you would expect to see this type of outcome, including cognitive function, because the autonomic influence, the vagus nerve input into the brain, has a very profound effect on just cognitive function. So in theory, directed at your question, someone who's metabolically healthy, they take these injections, you withdraw, I think in some people they're going to become insulin resistant, have these metabolic issues, but also could in theory develop cognitive decline. And after putting that video out a year ago or something, I had a couple of calls from people around the country saying, that's exactly what I experienced. I walked out of the store, I can't find my car right after I stopped the injections. And again, that's anecdotal, but at least theoretically, based on physiology, it makes sense to me.
Let me ask you a question regarding the difference between fat cell hyperplasia and fat cell hypertrophy. I've seen some suggestion that these GLP-1s sort of shift things toward a more hyperplastic scenario. So you have a lot more smaller cells, but a overall reduced mass. And that could have consequences down the road once you stop, because now you have more fat cells. And they get hungry and now they become hypertrophic. Is there anything to that?
I think so. Look, I think these injections do amazing things, but if you back up and you look at diabetes, traditional therapy for diabetes, and when we started treating diabetics with insulin, hey, this is great. Hey, that brings their blood sugar down. What we weren't seeing at the time is, okay, there's other stuff in the background that we're influencing in a very negative way. I think with these injections, there's more things that are positive that result from this therapy. But again, in the background, there's other stuff that no one's talking about that have the potential to be sort of just like insulin in diabetics, that in the long run are going to hurt people.
Yeah, fair enough.
But yeah, I think that's really directly to your questions. Yeah, the fat cells, you take visceral fat with the theory of personal fat threshold. I think that's wrong. That a person, based on their genes, they fill up the depots in their subcutaneous compartment of fat. And once that's filled, then they start storing fat in the viscera, and that is inherently inflammatory. I would argue that it's dysfunction in these neurological circuits between the gut and the brain that drives dysfunctional fat in the viscera. Again, with imbalance in that autonomic nervous system, that's really what's driving these inflamed adipocytes. So in a way, that's good. In the short term, that's good to have more adipocytes. Maybe they're not as inflamed, but long term, yeah, I can see the potential where it can bite us.
But you mentioned the classic combination of high carb, high fat, the donut basically is part of what's driving some of this. But are there other compounds? I'm thinking they made chocolate cake in 1920 and they weren't suffering through obesity epidemics. Are there other, because we've got all these novel food additives and ingredients and artificial colors and thickeners and emulsifiers and shelf stable preservatives. Are any of those other compounds you think somewhat to blame for this, or is it maybe we don't have enough data on that?
Yeah, maybe I don't know not enough about it. I'm open to it. I think it's probable, but I think with what we so consistently see in foods all around us, there's enough there in this. Even if you take the very simplistic analysis of the balance of fat, carb, or sugar, and salt, achieving that bliss point, there's a simple and universal enough proportion of ingredients in all foods that are processed to explain it. I don't think we have to look anywhere else, but I do think probably there are other things that contribute to it. I don't know enough about it. You go to the store and you look at stuff in boxes and you look at the nutrition label, they're all pretty much the same. Very low in protein, carb, low fat, but I think they have a formula. They have a set of formulas with some very foundational, basic things that has the effect on the brain of bringing us back to that food product that is largely responsible for the vast majority of the metabolic disease that we're seeing.
Yeah, I think within the food industry, working at these giant companies, they have scientists that actually know this stuff and they know how to design it to make it. In fact, I've talked to some of them that done that, and they actually feel pretty bad about it. In retrospect, they feel like their career was based on addicting people to these foods, and here we are today with a whole populace that's doing that. What is your thought for going forward? Obviously, you mentioned, what was her name? Fatima Stanford out of Harvard on the dietary guidelines panel saying obesity is more a genetic brain disorder or something along those ways. Where do you see things going? Are you hopeful? Are you concerned with regard to national policy?
Great question. Honestly, there's a part of me that's extremely discouraged. There's so much to overcome. I think it's doable. But I think you look at governmental agencies, whether it's the FDA and those committees and big pharma, as well as significant segments of the medical community, there's so much to overcome as far as their influence. Now, I'm at the point over the last 10 years, 8 years, I have become more and more focused direct to consumers. People are smart. I honestly think that is the only way we're going to change this. I don't think we're going to change. We should try. I'm not convinced we're going to make much change within the medical organizations and the hierarchy that exists. I think it's direct to consumer. As far as you look at prevention, I'm so focused on reversal, helping people who already have established metabolic disease. Woke up one night a few years ago and thought, man, I got to think also about prevention. And that is such an overwhelming task because it really starts in the adolescence of females who will eventually have children. It begins that early. And so when you really see how far back it goes in a family tree and the influence of epigenetics, it's pretty overwhelming. But I will say this, I held firmly to the carbohydrate insulin model for years. I haven't believed in CECO, calories in, calories out for almost ever. But I think that this tribal wars, I think we're not seeing the bigger picture. And that bigger picture has to do with the brain and the nervous system. I think these tribal wars about nutrition, I think it serves those big interests. I think they're laughing to the bank. It's sugar. No, it's fat. Truth is, it's both. And until we can figure that out and put together the bigger picture, we're always going to be on our heels. So I think the way forward is to effectively put together what I think is the bigger picture and to broadcast it more widely to people directly. The stuff that we've been told is just wrong so much of the time.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And I completely agree with you. It's going to be a grassroots thing. We're not going to have somebody from the government proclaiming that, because you look at the way the USDA is set up, their job is literally to sell commodities. That is what they do. And then they're designing the dietary guidelines. They're like, we got to sell all this corn and wheat and sugar and soybean. So this is what our dietary guidelines are going to look like, because that's part of our mission there. So
but you're a great example of doing this very thing at a grassroots level. I think you're a very effective leader in this way. I love your videos where you're eating a steak. It's fabulous. It's awesome. You're eating a steak, listening to somebody go on about something that's so flawed and so problematic. You can't argue with it. So I think you're doing a great job.
Like I said, and the nice thing is a lot of other people have taken up the sort of the flag as well, and we're seeing more and more of this stuff. I can imagine, because I felt as a surgeon, once I had this epiphany 10 years ago or so, that I'm going to have a hard time within the system. As a surgeon particularly, you are bound to a hospital. You can't just do bariatric surgery at your local clinic. You've got to follow and abide by all the rules and regulations and that type of stuff. So it's hard to do that type of outreach within that system, as I'm sure you're well aware.
Mount Everest behind me, this is my office. I left an employed position about 5 years ago, couldn't take it anymore. So I'm independent, and because of that, I can do things very differently, and I do. And Everest is the name of the surgery center we just opened. So I recognize exactly what you're talking about, and I've made some major changes in my career in the last 5 years to change how I do things. I don't want to be governed by people so far removed from direct patient care. It's crazy.
Yeah, my guess is we're going to see, as there's been just a tremendous explosion of administrative staff. Hospital administrators have gone up tenfold in the last 30, 40 years, whereas physicians have been pretty flat. And we see more and more physician extenders and providers, as they like to call them. And I think even though that we'll see being replaced slowly by some of this AI technology, where the drug companies are going to love that, because they're like, we don't have to deal with these pain in the ass doctors anymore. We just direct it to the, yeah. It's just like you type in something in the computer, answer a few questions, stick your finger in a machine so it can draw a little blood sample, and then it spits out a diagnosis, and your pills are in the mail the next day. I see that happening, with some doctor in the background probably signing off on this, but generally, yeah, it's interesting to see where healthcare is going to go. We are just about out of time. We got a couple of minutes left. Anything else you want to share before you go? And if not, just please share your social media, websites, or anything like that.
I mentioned it before we started this idea. I think the greatest argument for the carnivore diet has to do with physics. Up to this point, the approach to nutrition, weight, all of this, we are focused on calories. In other words, a unit of energy or heat. And that's really focused in the first law of thermodynamics. I would argue we're focusing on the wrong thermodynamic law. It's actually the second law, having to do with entropy. You think about, you ask the question, what do we get from the sun? Energy. The Earth radiates into space the same amount of energy that we receive from the sun. There's something else that we get from the sun, and it's actually, it can be, order or low entropy energy. And it's another conversation, but I think in time it will be the greatest argument for the carnivore diet. There's no more complicated, sophisticated, and ordered substance that we consume than animals. And again, conversation for another time, but there's a whole other field of data and evidence that suggests that aging itself is a matter of increasing entropy in systems in the body. And by consuming these modern engineered hyperpalatable foods, we are introducing high entropy into our bodies, and it's disrupting so many processes in the body. So that's a bit of a big topic, but I guess just to say that in time, I think your argument will be validated by physics, actually.
Interesting. That'll be interesting to see how entropy comes into this. So disorderedness. Yeah. Where can people find? I think I found you on Twitter, if I'm not sure, Dr. Brown. Yeah. Where do you hang out on social media if you do, and then share your websites and stuff like that?
Dr. Brown Boise on Twitter. I just joined a couple of months ago. Our website, idahobmi.com, and I have a YouTube channel, Idahobmi, where I do a bunch of videos, deep dives and stuff.
Yeah, I watched a couple of them a while back. That's what got me interested in chatting with you. So interesting stuff. Thank you for sharing that insight. And it's another interesting wrinkle into the ongoing. And you're right, there is a little war between the calorie people and the insulin people. And even in my book, I said, I think I don't like talking about weight loss because it's so contentious. Yeah. Hopefully we'll have some unifying theory of why everybody's so damn fat.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Appreciate it.